Apocalypse has always been one of the most powerful mutants to ever exist in the history of Marvel Comics, and where he's been missing since the end of House and Powers of X, he's finally back. What does that mean? I'll explain in this video. So what's going on here is this initially starts off with a fight between Apocalypse and his wife Genesis. And the fight between the two of them is basically for leadership of the various mutants that reside within the dimension of Amenth. Why is all of this happening in the first place? Okay, wind the clock back in Marvel Comics. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with how mutants have existed within Marvel, the mutants that you know, which is Cyclops and Jean Grey and Magneto and those guys, they're not the only mutants that are out there. That in recent years, what we learned is that within the Marvel Universe on Earth, there was a land called Okara. It was just an island that existed out there. And that what had happened is that the mutant Apocalypse and his wife Genesis had a life there for a time, and it was awesome, and they had their kids and so on and so forth. What ended up happening is that Okara was ultimately invaded by a being called Annihilation, leading an army of demons. Now, as Apocalypse and Genesis fought this war, what they started to realize is they couldn't win against this war of attrition. And so what ended up happening is Apocalypse basically left that place. His wife elected to stay behind and lead this army of mutants in a constant war against the forces of Annihilation, and the entire land of Okara was locked away and sealed away from Earth itself, so that they never had to worry about those demon forces invading Earth. The idea behind Apocalypse existing on Earth all this time was to constantly test the mutant population, force them to become better, and then once the mutants reached the best possible form they could, meaning only the strongest mutants on Earth existed, he would lead those mutants in a war alongside Genesis against the forces of Annihilation and ultimately win that conflict. And so following the events of House and Powers of X, which we don't really need to get into here regarding those details, Apocalypse ended up traveling back to Okara without his army and has basically been leading the people ever since. This is why this fight is happening between Genesis and Apocalypse. Apocalypse traveling back here, he's effectively become a philosopher. He's more of a good guy than the person he used to be, which is just super hardcore, super powerful, only the strong deserve to survive. Genesis and the mutants within this realm who have only known war see that as a sign of weakness. And so that's why Genesis is challenging him for ruling of the realm of Okara. And so what's so cool about this is that as the two of them fight, what Genesis reveals is this long lost secret that she had never told her husband, that at a past point in time, Annihilation approached her, the leader of these crazy demons and whatnot. Apocalypse was there when it happened, but when a conversation between Genesis and Annihilation took place, it took place within Genesis' mind. And Annihilation offered her a possible outcome, right? Offered her a kind of deal. Genesis ultimately turned it down, but Apocalypse had always been led to believe the deal was not in their favor, that it was effectively surrender, and so he just went along with whatever it was that she had told him. What had actually happened is that Annihilation had brokered a peace deal, that it was going to be the end of the war. Genesis turned it down because all the people in the realm of Okara had known was war and conflict. And so in her mind, that made them better. It made them stronger. It made them more powerful. She had basically become obsessed with war. She had become obsessed with conflict. The result of this is that when Apocalypse learns the truth, he effectively lashes out. He gets incredibly angry and starts attacking her with even more fervor than he did before. And that's when she basically reveals to him, this is your inherent weakness. One, you let your emotions get the better of you. And two, the Apocalypse I knew, the Apocalypse that I fell in love with, would never become a philosopher. He would never become a person that would preach whether or not doing whatever needs to be done is the right mode of action. No, he would say, if you are not strong enough to survive, you don't deserve to live. There's no arguing that, no ifs, ands, or buts. That's just the way things are. And so what Apocalypse does in one of the coolest moments here is he actually ends up taking these two swords that Genesis had stabbed him with, and he pulls them out, and he tells her, you fail to understand me. I am a mutant of the highest order. I can control every atom in my body. That's my mutant gift. Now, that's an important statement. And the reason why is because within Marvel Comics, the real powers of Apocalypse have always kind of been ambiguous. Is he immortal? Does he have the ability to grow to any size? We never really knew definitively what his actual powers were because Marvel had never really given us a definitive statement to flesh them out. This fixes all that. It basically says that Apocalypse can control the atoms in his body. It explains why he can give himself any superhuman ability outside of reality warping. It explains why it is he can grow or shrink to any size, why he can presumably teleport, although that's more due to technology than anything else. And it also explains his immortality and his ability to heal from virtually anything. The fact that he can just control what his body does or does not do. And so what ends up going on here is that word reaches the ears of Genesis that those mutants who have resided on Earth itself have now basically created Arakko. Here's the reason why that matters. At the end of Tens of Swords, not every mutant within the realm of Okara stayed there. Some left. But understand, every single mutant in this land is an Omega level mutant. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, it means they're some of the strongest mutants in existence. Each and every one of them are incredibly powerful. But those mutants who left the land of Okara and chose to travel to basically Earth, their goal initially was to blend in and make a life with all the other mutants that you know and love. Magneto, Professor Xavier, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, because those mutants had known nothing but war, and the goal of the X-Men and other mutants on Krakoa was to basically create peace on Earth for the mutant population, those two groups could not coexist. And so those mutants who left Okara traveled to Mars and then set up their own land called Arakko. And so what's happening here is this Genesis learning that seemingly mutants have conquered the world. Now, Apocalypse comes along and he makes this statement and saying, no, that's not necessarily true, but our mutant population is constantly being tested. That's the differing viewpoint between these two. In the eyes of Genesis, those mutants who had left Okara and traveled to Mars to basically form Arakko, they are, by virtue of not consistently facing war, becoming weaker. In her mind, they are kind of betrayers of the ideology of what mutants are supposed to be, constantly facing wars, constantly improving themselves, being tested over and over and over again, and proving themselves better each and every time. This realization that these mutants out there on Mars are becoming weaker comes by way of a woman named Mariana Stern showing up to effectively Genesis in a kind of astral form and revealing to her the events of Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternals. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that story, we covered it. You'll find a link to it down below the like button. This was basically a war where literally the Eternals went to war against the Avengers and the X-Men. It was a pretty amazing story. But what ended up happening in that story is that an Eternal who had been around for a very long time named Uranos was sent to Mars and wiped out something like 90% of the mutants who lived there. And so the fact that they had been defeated by such a foe is an indication to Genesis that they are weak, that they're not as strong as they're supposed to be. And that Apocalypse, in his statement of saying, I watched them from a distance, they're constantly being tested, they're not becoming weaker, they're becoming stronger. In the eyes of Genesis, it's a lie. None of that is true. That the mutants on Earth, so the X-Men that you're aware of, they're becoming weaker. That the mutants who left Okara and traveled to Arakko when 90% of their population were destroyed by Uranos, that shows that they're becoming weaker. Because if that fight were to happen immediately after they left Okara, they would have taken out Uranos like that. They would have eliminated that guy, no questions asked. And so what she says after defeating Apocalypse is she says, understand, you are the weaker of the two of us. I am stronger because all I've known is war. In the time that you spent on Earth, and especially after joining Krakoa, you became weak. You became a shell of your former self. And in this weakness, you are not fit to lead. Now, because of the fact that she was able to defeat Apocalypse, Apocalypse only respects those who are capable of defeating him. And so he ends up yielding the fight. He doesn't do it out of disgrace or anything. He chooses to yield on his own terms. And that's one of the cool things, because he says, if what you truly wish to do is travel to Earth, if you truly wish for me to open the gateway for you to leave, then I will do that. But understand, if you're going there to incite war, you will not find what you're looking for. And in fact, you will find mutants who are far more powerful than you think, than you truly believe. And your death is nigh. But he presents 3 Krakoan seeds. One of these seeds is given directly to Genesis herself. The other seed is kept for Apocalypse, and the third one is planted within the land of Okara. These seeds are basically gates. They're doorways, right? Genesis having one of these seeds means she can open a doorway wherever it is that she's at. She plants it in the ground, it sprouts up, the doorway opens, she passes through, and she'll end up back here in Okara. Apocalypse having the seed basically allows him to do the same thing. And so Genesis essentially passes through through the gateway, which is actually going to initiate what's called the Genesis War in Marvel Comics, which is basically a war of Omega level mutants, some of the most powerful mutants in existence, against the rest of the mutant population on Earth. Here's the thing to understand. Within Marvel, there are mutants who have been killed that have not been resurrected, who are some of the most powerful beings in existence. A good example of this is Matthew Malloy. He's dead. They prevented him from being born, but this kid had the power to tap into a completely different dimension of unlimited power, and his level was so high, he could resurrect himself from the dead. It was crazy how powerful he was. This is the kind of thing that Genesis is gonna be facing off against. Any number of situations where she travels to Earth, she faces off against the mutant population, someone comes along, they snap her fingers, and she ceases to exist. I doubt it'll end that way. It's simply to make the point, this girl has no idea what she's getting into. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. It's awesome to see Apocalypse back. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.